Drafting Archetypes is brought to you by Game Grid Lehigh. Game Grid Lehigh is an amazing place to buy and sell Magic the Gathering singles. Whether you're building a new cube or crafting your new constructed deck, Game Grid Lehigh is the place to do it. Got a draft coming up with some friends? Buy some seal product here and get it quick. So click the referral link in the description to help out the show, and don't forget to use the code DRAFTPRO10 to get 10% off on your next order at gglehigh.com.
Hi everyone, this is Sam Black with Drafting Archetypes, and this week I will be discussing Blue-Red in Dominaria United. Blue-Red is an aggressive deck for the most part, with an unusually low creature count for an aggressive deck. Looking over recent trophy decks, it seems pretty clear that I think you want between 10 and 13 creatures most of the time, though I've seen recent trophies with as few as 8 and as many as 16 creatures, so pretty wide range acceptable, but in the middle of that seems to be most common and makes sense to me in terms of, you want to have enough creatures to apply pressure because you are pretty aggressive, but you also want enough spells to take advantage of all of your creature triggers that look for spells in various ways. I think it's important to note, with a deck like this that's really trying to combine a lot of different pieces, it's pretty good to have a target in mind in terms of like what you're looking for. So I think that number's good to keep in mind when you're drafting Blue-Red. Also, Get2 Amplifier is the most played card in Blue-Red, despite being pretty far from the best performing card, but notably, it is the best performing 2-mana common creature. So it's reasonable that it gets played so much, because as an aggressive deck, you do really want 2-drops, and it's the best available at common. Notably, I say it's the best available at common. Balmor and Electrostatic Infantry are notable standouts at uncommon that perform way better. And this is, common of a lot of aggressive archetypes that they really, the strongest versions of them are the ones that have higher rarity 2-drops in particular, because 2-drops are so important for aggressive decks. And the higher rarity 2-drops are just so much better than the common ones that having these strong high rarity 2-drops is a good reason to draft the deck and something that'll give you a big edge when you do draft the deck. So look to be Blue-Red if you start with a Balmor or Electrostatic Infantry or get one early. And of course, if you're in Blue-Red and you see a card like that, be sure to take it over most other things because it's not very replaceable and really makes your deck a lot better at doing the thing that it's trying to do. If you don't see those, Get2 Amplifier, Goblin Picker, or Haunting Figment can work out instead, but you hope to, have a few of the better ones. Battlewing Mystic's another solid uncommon that's not as exceptional as Balmor or Infantry. As far as the top end, similar situation in terms of the uncommon is a lot better than the commons, specifically Frostfall Strider, the uncommon 4/4 that taps something down, it doesn't untap, and it itself has ward, performs way better than common 5-drops like Miria's Outrider. In this case, I think it's not important to have a 5-mana creature. If you don't have exactly Frostfall Strider, it's fine to just not play a 5-mana creature. But if you are going to play a 5, it should be Frostfall Strider. Notably, not Najal or any other, uncommons. I guess, like, even the rare Blue Defiler isn't particularly good. Frostfall Strider is better. But for the most part, most of the time, I think you just don't want 5-mana creatures in this deck, with Strider as a notable exception just for being playable. So the key cards that you're looking for at common are mostly spells. Tolarian Geyser, Lightning Strike, Phyrexian Espionage, Impulse, Flowstone Infusion, and Essence Scatter, in roughly that order, are kind of the bread and butter of your archetype. The two standout creatures that come in are Talus Lookout and Tolarian Terror. Those are kind of just the two common blue standout creatures for any blue deck, basically. Talus Lookout, obviously better the more blue you are and doesn't require spells as much. And Tolarian Terror gets better the more spells you have, especially if those spells replace themselves. I would count a spell that replaces itself as like 1.5 spells that don't replace themselves for getting to whatever number you might imagine you want your number to be when counting a number for Tolarian Terror. A few things that I feel like I'm still kind of just learning and incorporating into how I approach blue-red, as this is not an archetype that I have been personally drawn to very much. My default approach is to exist more on the attrition end of the spectrum than the tempo end, and this is very much a tempo deck, so not really my wheelhouse for the most part. So some things I've picked up in studying the data to prepare for this that I thought were noteworthy. Flowstone Kavu is the third most successful creature, notably ahead of Soaring Drake and every 2-drop. Menace makes Flowstone Kavu pretty hard to block. If your opponent does actively want to block it and like leave something back to block it, and then you use a removal spell, sometimes that means they wasted an attack and you hit them anyway. Also, when the game goes long and you don't need all of your mana, it hits pretty hard and it can trade up against larger creatures and stuff like that. So not super surprising to see that it's the most successful creature, but I think that I'd been probably incorrectly prioritizing Soaring Drake over it. Also, I personally had significant experiences with flooding out when I tried blue-red, and then because of that, I wanted to go to Academy Wall to try to fix this problem, to deal with like, oh, well, I just cantrip a lot and then I have too many lands in my hand. That is the wrong way to go about things. The solution isn't to add Academy Wall, which is a creature and doesn't trigger your spell stuff. And how many times do you have to loot after having, gone down a card in terms of your actual plan for the most part to play the wall before you've made up for having spent that mana and used that card, especially given how long it takes to get those loots. Academy Wall, the data makes very, very clear, is not where you want to be. And I think what happened is that I was overrating things like timely interference that are very, very low impact, just a way to cast another spell to get a trigger. And rather than, throwing good money after bad by adding another slot to try to mitigate the flood issues with playing these low impact cantrips, because what I was saying about how, cards that replace themselves, I kind of count them more than cards that don't. So I was trying to maximize cards that replace themselves. Turns out you still, can't be spending all of your mana spinning your wheels when you're trying to play an aggressive deck. So it's better to prioritize the spells that affect the board or replace themselves in a way that doesn't lead to flooding out. So that would be Phyrexian Espionage and Impulse, where when you cast it, you're not drawing half of a spell or 2/3 of a spell. You're drawing at least another spell most of the time. And then Geyser is, the best of it because you both get to draw something and affect the board. And then Lightning Strike and Flowstone Infusion are obviously perfect because they are both spells and affect the board in a tempo positive way. Trade with your opponent so you're not falling behind on partial resources or however you interpret drawing more lands than you need. And then Essence Scatter is very good at being a spell that trades profitably with a creature. The problem with it relative to the other removal is that you can't cast it proactively or on your turn to get some of those more, the triggers that Balmor, it doesn't work especially well with. So Blue-Red as a tempo deck really wants to, and also G2 Amplifier and Haunting Figment, all pretty importantly. So Essence Scatter is a little bit awkward there. It's acceptable. It's a strong blue card that is another spell for your Tolarian Terror and stuff, or your Electrostatic Infantry, but not quite as smooth of a fit for a really proactive deck. Also, notably, combat tricks, while a few of them can be nice and the deck uses them pretty well because you are attacking, they suffer from the fact that they really need to be played at a specific time to get the most out of them. Whereas this deck is really looking to be able to use its cards really proactively and kind of spend its mana on its own terms and do stuff when you want. So that's kind of like a strike against combat tricks broadly, which, you know, is another mark against timely interference if you're trying to use it that way. And then also means that you don't really want to prioritize stuff like shore up. It's okay to have a little of that, but you want most of your spells to be, that core of impulse, espionage, geyser, lightning strike, flowstone, infusion. As far as how to get into the deck, I touched on that a bit with, well, if you see, a Balmor or electrostatic infantry type card, is going to really strongly point you toward exactly this deck and give you a really strong start in that direction. Obviously, also, you could just start by taking strong blue and red common removal spells. Tolarian, Geyser, and Lightning Strike are just reasonable high picks. They're strong cards. If you have a few of them and this is what's open, then, you just keep taking that stuff and eventually you find some creatures that work well with it. Of course, you don't need to go too far to your way to prioritize creatures since, you're not looking to have all that many of them. So it's pretty safe to throughout pack 1 and most of the draft, just prioritize getting as many of the good instants and sorceries as you can, and then kind of pick up those creatures in the back half of the pack or whenever there's, not good spell alternative. And your goblin pickers and infantries and figments, none of those are high picks for anyone really. So you should just kind of accidentally get the common creatures that you need to kind of round out your deck. And as long as you prioritize those key creatures, the uncommons, Talus Lookout, and Tolarian Terror, you can pretty safely prioritize spells over creatures throughout most, if not the entire draft. Really pretty straightforward archetype. The main pitfalls to avoid are, having the wrong mix of creatures and spells. I think if you stay in that 10 to 14 creature range, you should be pretty safe. Having too much air, so if your spells are, too many reactive spells or too much air, just generally not being able to cast your spells on your own term and affect the battlefield with them. So you want to minimize how many of your spells are kind of those more narrow, timely interference, shore up, and furious bellow type spells. Maximize the spells that are, and also, Essence Scatter to some extent would fit in that kind of, narrow. It's okay to have a little of this, but you want the bulk of your spells to be something else kind of space. And then again, just as many geysers, strikes, espionages, impulses, and infusions as you can get. And that should make up the bulk of your deck. Obviously any strong rares that you get in this space are just going to improve your deck, as with anything. But I do think that this is a deck that really, doesn't need them. A lot of, all the synergies here exist at common. There are not very many particularly synergistic rares. The best rare in this archetype, incidentally, is Squee. There are some, uncommon signposts that are exceptional here. Balmor, Fires of Victory, Micromancer, and Electrostatic Infantry in particular. But I think this is a deck that if everyone in the draft is just building a deck out of commons, this is going to be one of the best decks. There are just, a lot of, there's enough synergy, enough power at common. And again, the fact that those 2 drops that you want, you can get pretty late makes things a lot easier. So this is a reasonably safe deck to draft in terms of there's plenty of support for it. And it's not that hard, and it's pretty strong and reasonably straightforward. All of the normal issues in terms of figuring out how to, push damage, when to like play another creature versus using a Tolarian Geyser. Like if you played a 2-drop and then your opponent plays a thing, is it better for you to like play your Floatstone Kavu first and then Geyser later? Or is it better to just like Geyser and hit them and figure out, get that damage in while you can, not miss an attack step? Usually I would say just play your other creature first and then start playing the tempo spells, but really depends on the exact situation, whether you need, if it's like a Geyser, are you looking to, draw a card to hit your next land drop? Especially if you have something more expensive you're looking to play, are you trying to like get a Tolarian Terror online faster, stuff like that. But for the most part, this is a deck that's just looking to use its mana, play its creatures, and then use some tempo spells to get those creatures through and recharge with Espionage and Impulse, keep your spells flowing, keep your triggers coming. If you have Amplifier and other 2-drops and you think you're going to get to 5, save your Amplifier to kick it. Otherwise, maybe play it earlier to get more damage if you're going to be playing spells over the next few turns. Basic stuff like that. So yeah, that covers the notes here. Not, I guess, vague mention about splashing, since it's such a common thing to think about in this format. I don't think that there are a lot of cards that this deck wants to splash. It's nice if you can have a little bit of white mana or a little bit of black mana. White for Geyser if you want to kick it, black if you get Rona's Vortex. But I wouldn't go out of my way to have a lot of white dual lands. I don't think you would want to play more than 2-ish or something. Like, it's not particularly important to kick Geyser. And similar with black, like even if I have a Vortex, maybe if I have like 2 Vortexes and a Micromancer, then I might want like, 3 or more black duals. But, for the most part, if I just have like a Vortex, I wouldn't really want more than 2. I think Grotto is pretty good here. The Scry really helps, and that can cover kind of all of your weird little kickers. But for the most part, I don't think that the cards that you're playing benefit a lot from being kicked, except for, cards that are blue and kick for red, or are red and kick for blue, that you're going to be able to kick naturally anyway. As far as like splashing spells, I suppose another relevant white splash is Keldon Strike Team, but I think that that's mostly not a card you're looking to play. I have played versions of this deck that splash. So, splashing green leads you into the like Teamer Tricks archetype that I've talked about. Splashing black puts you into Grixis control, makes you likely to be more of an attrition kind of deck. Splashing white would be for stuff like Wrath, Protect the Negotiators. That stuff's like okay, but it's all kind of early and puts a lot of strain on your mana base and makes the deck a little bit like, it gives you a lot more late game power. Weirdly, I mean, kind of, it more like, what's the best way to put it? Resilience, maybe? Like, you're adding cheap cards that don't really go that far over the top late and want to be played early, but they don't really make your deck faster, which you're generally trying to be. Like Wrath in particular, you often end up kind of giving up damage to draw cards so that you're better late, but that's kind of a weird thing to try to do in a tempo deck. So while it's a really, really strong card that plays well with these things, it kind of puts you in an awkward space and puts a lot of pressure on your mana base. So I guess this is to say that if I have Wrath, I would much rather be in the like base blue-white splash red rather than base blue-red splash white, and kind of thinking about my deck in more of a like blue-white mindset rather than a blue-red mindset, where I want to, try to be able to focus on the blue-red mindset being more of a tempo mindset, if all of that makes sense. That covers Archetype from my lecture and my notes. If anyone in chat has any questions, as always, please submit those now. This is the time when I would normally thank my patrons and plug patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. No new patrons this week, but I do want to mention another thing that I think I've mentioned before on this podcast, but I'm not totally sure. The Magic Summit is a Magic event coming up in Salt Lake City that will be happening at the same time as the Brothers of War pre-release, and it's going to be a huge tournament with a pre-release event that has a Black Lotus as the prize, and then a whole bunch of side events and stuff like that. I think it's going to be a really cool event. I've always wanted to play kind of like a pre-release with like actual stakes, show off, who's best at understanding a set on the first day. I hope it's me, but it could be anybody else also, of course. And if you think that's an environment you might thrive in, or just something that sounds fun to you, highly recommend checking it out. And I have a discount code for that event, which is just Sam Black. I'll try to put a link to that somewhere, but I will be at that, and encourage anyone else who's going to find me and say hi, and anyone who's thinking about going to check it out. And if you decide to go, to, again, use that discount code Sam Black. So, questions for the archetype. Would you play Balamor on turn 2 as a way to push damage / eat removal, or do you wait until much later to use it as an overrun, assuming it'll die the next turn? Some of that is going to depend on what lands and stuff you've seen from your opponent, like how likely it is that they're going to have a removal spell for it. Another big question is, what's the alternative? Are you doing nothing with your mana? Are you holding up Essence Scatter? Are you holding up Essence Scatter and Impulse? Are you playing a 2-drop? Are you playing a tapped land and kind of only wasting 1 mana? Are you on the play or the draw? All that stuff matters. I think that I would generally play Balamor most of the time if I didn't have another creature, but I would maybe play a different creature first if I did have another creature. And by maybe, I mean, I think I would almost always play a different 2-drop rather than playing Balamor on 2, but I wouldn't want to not play a 2-drop on the play to try to get more value out of Balamor later. If I'm on the draw and I have, I can either play Balamor or hold up Essence Scatter. If my opponent hasn't made a play, I might wait. I might play Balamor. Kind of depends on, again, just the rest of my hand and my deck in terms of, do I feel like waiting around is going to work out well for me, or do I feel like I need to get under them? It's a good question, but pretty hard to generalize for. I think that I, in general, want to err toward, I hope that I've played my deck in a way that it's not totally reliant on Balamor, and I need to just, put my aggressive cards into play and try to get value out of them. How do you approach drafting blue-red without getting Balamor, Infantry, or Terror in the early packs? Would you splash other colors or consider taking Coral Colony and some Academy Walls? No, I would definitely not do the try to turn it into a control deck with Coral Colony and Academy Walls kind of thing. And I wouldn't try to play big creatures. I think if you don't get Balamor and Infantry, you're better off just trying to rely on Talus Lookout, ideally. Alternatively, just like Flowstone Kavu and Goblin Picker, Amplifier, and Figment. I think the deck really does want to be proactive. Basically, I don't think this is an archetype where you can decide to just go, grindy control instead. There are too many different ways that people just go over you in this format, every possible different direction. You really, really don't have the tools to play a long game just based on a Coral Colony and an Academy Wall. You do want to be proactive with your blue-red decks. So if you don't get the premium creatures, just use the second tier creatures, and I hope that you're getting premium spells instead, or maybe you're supposed to be in a different color pair. But I would not consider blue-red wall control to be one of my alternatives. I would rather just pivot into another archetype, find different colors if these colors aren't open. How much difference do you perceive of the blue-red deck and Temur Tricks? I think that it is a smooth pivot from one to the other. You can certainly have a blue-red deck that's kind of just splashing green for some of the tricks. And then if green aggressive creatures end up being more open, you can pretty smoothly transition to either your red or blue cards being splashed. I think if you're looking for like off-ramps and pivots, I would much rather look to adding green or pivoting into, some kind of aggressive combat tricks based deck rather than trying to pivot more controlling and finding more expensive red and blue creatures or more defensive red and blue creatures. Given that the archetype often has a number of amplifiers, figments, or flame sages, how much lower do you rate picking up scatters and other counter spells? Appreciably. Like Essence Scatter is a really good card. I think Essence Scatter is a stronger card in this format than, say, Flowstone Infusion. But in this archetype, I would take Flowstone Infusion over Essence Scatter because you really do want to be able to use your cards on your terms and on your turn. All right, looks like that's going to cover it. Nice, short, simple episode for a pretty simple archetype. I will say that, while I think that what's going on here is pretty straightforward, there are a number of meaningful traps to avoid. And I think that I personally had a bit of a level up moment just kind of in thinking about and studying for this episode. I think that, how to deal with, how many cards that replace themselves you want and how to avoid flooding out if you have too much of that and what kind of spells to prioritize is a thing that hadn't quite clicked properly for me. And I think that it makes sense that you really want to focus on, making sure that your spells are, for the most part, impactful rather than kind of air. It was a significant step in understanding exactly how I want to be approaching this for me. So if anyone else was kind of struggling in the same space that I was, hopefully this helps you too. Anyway, the one last question from chat, slightly off topic, but since I did mention it earlier, am I going to be signing cards at the summit? Yes. Anytime you can find me, if you have something you'd like me to sign, I'm happy to sign it for you or, whatever else. If you want me to take a look at a deck or something, if I have time, I'm generally happy to. Again, thanks for listening, everyone. And that I think we'll likely wrap up my coverage of Dominaria United. Next week, I'm going to be talking about cube drafting, not looking at a particular archetype in a particular cube, but taking a broader look at my approach to cubes, especially unfamiliar cubes, and my first drafts in cubes, and other kind of big picture issues for cube drafting on the big picture level. So doing something a little bit different next week, inspired by my time at CubeCon last weekend. I think I'm looking forward to it. Should be a pretty fun episode. And then after that, we can probably start getting into Brothers War stuff. Thanks, and looking forward to some fun, different kinds of stuff in the upcoming weeks. And I'll be back later.